drawn to that picture. Many of you know Kevin Anderson, who often does our PowerPoints most every week. And I was amazed when he sent that one this week because he paid attention to the story and he's been there, along with Ann and some other folks who went with me a couple of years ago. That long ago? A while back. That is the ruins of the synagogue in Capernaum. And what do you see coming out of the synagogue or the wall there? It's something scary looking, huh? That's today's biblical story. It happens in Capernaum, on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus centered his ministry in the region of Galilee. If you remember last week, we talked about Jesus coming into Galilee after John had been arrested and proclaiming that the time was fulfilled, the kingdom of God has come near, it's time to repent and believe the good news. And he went up to 4 fishermen, 2 at a time, and with nothing more than a one-sentence invitation: follow me and I'll make you become fishers of people. They left everything and followed. Then they went to Capernaum. And on the Sabbath day, he entered the synagogue and taught. And they were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority, and not as the scribes. Just then there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent. Come out of him." And immediately the unclean spirit, convulsing the man and crying out with a loud voice, came out. And all of them were amazed, so that they began to say to one another, "What is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." And at once his fame began to spread throughout all the surrounding region of Galilee. This is the word of the Lord. Harbin talked with the children about teachers and about being a school teacher. We all had school teachers, I would venture to guess. For some of us, it's a more distant memory than others. But all of us, whether you're still in school now or it's been a long time, as has been for me and some of us, remember some of our teachers. And I say some because I doubt that any of us remember all of our teachers. If I said, "Give me the name of every teacher you ever had," you might be hard-pressed. I could probably name all of my seminary professors. It was a small school. It wasn't that big a faculty, and that's the stage at which I had the most at stake. And so I was probably the most invested learner at that stage than I was earlier on. But of the various teachers in college and in high school and back in elementary school, the ones whose names and faces I can remember were, for one reason or the other, they were either the best ones I had or the worst. Now, I'm not here to say bad teachers, but anyone who's had the experience of being a student knows that some teachers, though they are credentialed, do not necessarily command the subject, or there may be other issues that renders them less than authoritative. I remember Charles Feltner. Now, it's always a problem when I don't make up the name of somebody. I give you the actual name, because there's an outside chance some of you might know Charles Feltner from way back when. And believe it or not, I could tell you some stories about people I thought would never be recognized, and people come up to me and told me exactly who I was talking about. But I remember Mr. Feltner and how we liked him, but we didn't take him seriously. He was credentialed, but he was, well, what's the word I want to use? Somewhat befuddled. And he carried his befuddlement into his teaching style. And he was notorious for mispronunciation. Get it? That was only one of the terms that I often heard him use. And most memorable from Charles Feltner in world history class was when there was a reference to great classical composers such as Beethoven. Come on. Do you remember something like that? I can hear his voice saying it to this day. Beethoven. Another teacher from the same era, early high school years. He was our history teacher. He was our debate coach. He was a Baptist pastor. He was a powerful individual who we deeply respected, and he had authority. Not heavy-handed authority, but we did whatever he needed us to do. And his name was Shirley. Shirley Spark. In spite of the advice of Leslie Nielsen back in Airplane, don't call me Shirley. And his having a name like Shirley didn't diminish his authority at all, because there was something in his person, in his depth of character, in the way he internalized what he was teaching and conveyed it to us, that gave him a deeper authority than what came from his credentials. Now, when I think about those kind of distinctions among teachers I've known, and I try to speculate what was going on with the folks in the synagogue at Capernaum that day when Jesus came and taught, and they said, he teaches as one who has authority, as one having authority, not like the scribes. The scribes had the credentials. The scribes had centuries worth of the credentials of their faith tradition. They were the experts in the law. But simply knowing the law didn't mean you had the authority in the way you taught and conveyed the law. And there was in Jesus something deeper. Mark tells us the story, as we find in almost all the stories in Mark's gospel, in very scant detail. Not much detail given. You've got to fill in a lot of blanks. And it's ironic because we're talking here about the impact of his teaching. He astonished them with his teaching. And afterwards, when he cast out the demon, they referred to his authority, a new teaching that's done with authority. So there's this authoritative teaching that Mark tells us about without telling us anything about the content of Jesus' teaching. And that's in great contrast to what all the other gospel writers do. Matthew's gospel begins with Jesus' ministry in Galilee and the crowd responses, but very quickly we're up on the Mount of Beatitudes, and we've got 3 chapters worth of teachings in the Sermon on the Mount. A lot of the content of Jesus' teaching. In Luke's gospel, Jesus begins his ministry by going to his hometown of Nazareth and going to the synagogue. But again, the story tells us in great detail what he said. He opened the scroll to the prophet Isaiah. He read the part that said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he called me to preach good news to the poor." And that set the tone for Jesus' ministry. John's gospel is filled with Jesus' discourses and teaching. But Mark, that emphasizes Jesus' power as a teacher, tells us virtually nothing of what he said in his teaching, only its impact. To appreciate his authority, we have to look beyond the content of his teaching to who Jesus was and what he did. That was the base of that authority. We follow him from that event as he's dining with tax collectors and sinners, as he's pressing up against the norms and standards of the faith tradition of his day, as he got into conflict with religious leaders because he didn't dismiss the laws of the Sabbath, but when a human need took precedence, like feeding people who were hungry, he said the Sabbath is made for people, not people for the Sabbath. He embraced the way of God in ways that were at the depths of his being, and that even in the confrontation with Pilate, he showed great power by maintaining silence. He operated out of an authority that was deeper than the content of his teachings, than any credentials that he might have. He taught as one having authority, and not as the scribes. Well, our story shows how that power comes into conflict with an opposing power. And there's another point at which the story, at least to our modern sensibilities, gets a little queasy. What do you do with a story in which the other main character is a man who's possessed with an unclean spirit? We're kind of uneasy about unclean spirits, about the idea of demonic possession. And again, we don't have many current frame of references that are very helpful. You may remember this one from a generation ago, and that was somewhat shocking and scandalous when the movie version of The Exorcist became popular, and even more vividly violent ones have come along the way since then. But Hollywood wouldn't be playing that up and wouldn't be playing on that if there wasn't some kind of a deeper part of us that is apprehensive about the presence of evil. Even though our modern scientific sophistication would say what the Bible talks about as demonic possession was probably seizures of some kind or some form of mental illness or some disorder that conveyed itself in that way. As Fred Craddock has aptly stated, the fact that we have outgrown and dismissed our belief in demon possession hasn't done very much to eradicate evil from the world. The fact that we don't believe in demon possession in the way the ancients did doesn't mean that there is not a power of evil that we struggle with, and that is at work in the world. And you don't have to go too far beyond each day's newspaper or the latest report on hate crimes or the degree to which the systems that shape and impact our children, our families, are so destructive in their nature. The late M. Scott Peck, who was probably best known for his book, The Road Less Traveled, a generation or so ago, also wrote other books, such as The People of the Lie, which grew out of his practice as a psychiatrist, in which he described out of his clinical practice instances that go beyond our concept of people being dysfunctional to where he saw the raw power of evil at work in destructive patterns that impacted the people he was working with in therapy. Ask any counselor, any teacher, any pastor, any leader, if we've not come up headlong against something that felt like a deeper power than just human interaction. Evil that we struggle with. And what this story is about, while it may be in language and in images that we don't relate to in our world today, indeed is about part of what we struggle with in life, even in the church. I hate to say it, but across my years of experience in ministry, there have been moments when I saw something happen and something come through in a person's words or actions that said to me, some other spirit's at work here. We are shocked when we find it here even in our own midst, but so were the folks at Capernaum. You've got to be careful in hearing the story to realize that for that guy to get up and say what he did and did what he did was outside the norms of a normal worship service. If somebody got up and did that here, obviously it would get a certain kind of attention. But I also realize in looking at that happening in the story, from the perspective of what were the norms and standards for coming together in the synagogue, and I say, wait a minute. If that guy was a raving, demon-possessed person, if he was a card-carrying demoniac, they'd have never let him in the door to start with. He's unclean. Someone possessed by an unclean spirit, just like a leper, or someone with a running sore, or any kind of vivid, evident disease, wouldn't be allowed into the place of worship. Anyone who was known to be ritually impure wouldn't be allowed in the place of worship. Whatever happened there happened because in the authority of Jesus' teaching, something called out the evil spirit that was there in someone. It's been proposed that preachers ought to measure their sermons by whether or not the unclean spirits sleep through them or not. Or do we dare to hearken upon the truth in such a powerful way that it would call out the unclean spirit? We come up against it. But what do we do when it jumps out in our midst? What did the church do for generation after generation after the culture had identified slavery as being evil, but the church was still in complicity with it? What did Christians in Europe do when the Holocaust was going on and yet security led to compliance and at least indirect implication? What do we do in our own day as we still struggle around the rights of those who were marginalized, be it for any variety of reasons? When evil presents itself, what is our response? What did Jesus model for us in his firm conviction out of the authority from which he spoke? Well, I came across a story the other day that gives at least one example of how that got embodied in the life of the church. It must have been a United Methodist church because references are made to bishops and district superintendents. Anybody else besides Methodists have BSs? No, our Methodists here confirms it had to have been a Methodist church if they were referring to district superintendents. It had to do with a congregation that was particularly destructive, that it had 11 ministers in 9 years' time. That was, as we clergy like to say, a clergy killer congregation. In that system, that meant every year at conference time, the minister was coming to the bishop and the DS saying, you got to get me out of here. Or the church was coming to him saying, you got to get that guy or gal out of here. There was obviously a cycle of conflict and destructive patterns that was going on over and over again. It was a deeply troubled congregation. And the bishop convened a cross-section of lay leaders and clergy and leaders from that congregation to both identify the problems, air the concerns, seek for discernment, and lead them in prayer. And the bishop asked that there be a time of silence. And following that time of silent prayer, a voice spoke up from around the circle who said, "I'll go." It was Deborah. Deborah had been through trauma and crisis in recent years of her ministry, and those who were aware of it around the room did a quiet gasp. A few years before, Deborah had gone through a scandalous divorce, a downward spiral into alcoholism, drunk driving charges that resulted in a period of time in prison and an intensive time in a clinical treatment program. There have been questions as to whether or not her credentials would be removed, but the wisdom of the bishop had ultimately been to honor her many years of service prior to that, and hopefully for her to spend her last few years before retirement in some quiet, calmer setting in which she could finish out her ministry. Hardly what you picture in this church that she just volunteered for. And she sensed that there would be that concern about it. And so she turned to those around the room who knew her and said, "This is a community that's in pain, and I know a little bit about pain." And there was also a deep sense that the Spirit was moving and working in that decision. Deborah made one request to the bishop, which is to say, "If I go there, will you back me up in any decisions I make as to how to lead the congregation through this complicated time it's living through?" And after some prayerful discernment, the bishop agreed. The bishop and the district superintendent met with the congregation's leadership, and they made the agreement to accept her, though they were somewhat shocked that she would willfully take on such a challenge at this stage in her life. And she made the same request of the leadership in the congregation, that they back her up in her decisions as to how to go about leading this congregation at this time. And with a nod from the bishop and the DS, they agreed as well, and agreed to be in prayer for her daily. And the first thing she said was that she intended to not assume any major pastoral responsibilities, including preaching, until she had gone and visited every member of the congregation. They'd need to get someone else to preach and lead worship and carry on other routine tasks, and they agreed to do that. And she spent several weeks, morning, noon, and night, going to every home, every apartment, every hospital bed, every nursing home, every place where she met and heard their stories, and asked them two basic questions. One, how did you come to love Jesus? And two, how did you decide that you needed to serve Jesus through this congregation? She went to every person in the church over those weeks except one who steadfastly refused to have her come and visit. You get the idea that this may be the troublemaker, or one who'd been deeply at the core of that congregation's destructive pattern. His name was Harry. They told her about him. She heard about him. She knew what a challenge it was. Folks had said he hadn't been the same for many years since his wife's death, and he steadily refused to even let her come visit. So she went on. She agreed to preach on the very first Sunday. Her sermon was, not to be surprised, built on the same basic structure as the conversations she'd had with everyone else. And she told them how she had come to love Jesus and how she believed God was calling her to serve Christ with this congregation. It was a compelling and moving sermon. People were caught up in it. Many of them had tears in their eyes as the sermon ended, and as she led them in prayer, and in a moment of silence at the end of the prayer, there was a shout in one of the pews towards the back, as Harry stood up and said, "Sister, what do you think you're doing? We know about you. We know you ran your husband off and that you're a drunk, and you're the last person in the world we need to lead this church. We got plenty of problems already without you." He was red in the face. His knuckles were white as he gripped the pew in front of him. There was an audible gasp and an awkward silence. And Deborah met his stare with her own gaze and came down from the pulpit and went up to where Harry was standing and said, "Harry, I'm a sinner, a forgiven sinner. And I've come to be here and to lead and serve with other forgiven sinners." And then she, empowered by something other than her own thought, said, "I've heard about Milton, and I know how much you must have loved her and how deeply you must miss her." And at that, Harry collapsed into tears. He collapsed into her arms as she embraced him, and as she invited the congregation to come and stand around them and join her in a prayer, a healing prayer for Harry and for them. And Deborah says that as she ended the prayer, there was a palpable sense that something had moved away, had left. A spirit of turmoil that had been there was gone. A different kind of spirit was surrounding them. Deborah continued to serve that congregation for 12 years, well into her mid-70s before she retired. Harry became her most outspoken supporter, and even to the last day of his life, affirmed to the community and to her that she had been an answer to prayer. Now that's a heroic story. It's a story about someone who embodied the authority that comes out of the love of Christ in a particularly powerful way. But we need not look at that as something that somebody else could do, because we, like all the disciples of Jesus who've gone before us, are ones who were empowered, even as he empowered them to go out teaching, casting out demons, healing, offering the gifts. So that's a part of the commission that we live in as well. Not by the credentials that we have so much as the degree to which we live in the kind of radically inclusive love that was the core of Jesus' authority. To play nice with religion, to ignore evil when it's straight in our face, to talk the talk but not walk the walk, are all things that will give us no more credibility than my colleagues and I in the 9th grade gave to Charles Feltner. But to live out of that power, to let the radical love that is the love of Jesus Christ shape and guide the way we live and serve with authority, will allow more of that light and power to come into our world. As we pray for God's guidance and direction today, may it be for grace and peace, that the authority with which we live our lives might not come so much from who we are, but whose we are.